Good morning again, Eastridge Chapel class. You are joining us this morning for part 2 of yet another accidental 2-part series. This one is entitled Redemption and What to Do with It. I wanted to take a minute or two now to recap what happened in last week's video to give you a little more of a platform for this week's exploration. We are studying right now face-to-face encounters with Jesus, and the one we're focusing on is Jesus' encounter with a demon-possessed man in Mark chapter 5. We talked about last week how Jesus had sailed from Capernaum to the other side of the sea, and the first thing that happens right out of the boat is he encounters this demon-possessed man. We saw in the early stages of their interaction. Number one, we saw that Jesus was bigger than the demons. That was important for us because it gave us an opportunity to reflect on the fact that Jesus is still more powerful than our demons, regardless of what those demons are. When we see the way these demons respond by begging for mercy in the face of Jesus, I hope it gives us encouragement and hope that whatever demon you're struggling with, by bringing Jesus face to face with that demon, those demons will respond the exact same way as they do in this passage. Our second takeaway from last week is that spiritual concerns are certainly and always more important than earthly concerns. The need for this man to be healed of the demons that possessed him was far more important than the economic devastation that was going to be unleashed on these people at the death of 2,000 pigs that we talked about last week weren't hobby pigs. There was some economic devastation with this event. But the need to heal a man of the demons that possessed him was far more important and far more powerful. I wanted to reiterate that again because I recognize in the current moment we're living in, those of you with stark economic need probably hear that a little differently than you did maybe a few months ago. I've been saying for the last few weeks that your spiritual needs and your spiritual concerns are far more important than those economic needs. That doesn't mean those economic needs aren't there. That doesn't mean they're not tangible. It doesn't mean they're not real, and it doesn't mean they don't hurt. I recognize that they do, and if you're in that circumstance, I want to beg you again, please reach out. Let us be of service to you. However, I am going to continue to double down on my reality and my statement that your spiritual needs are simply more important than those economic needs, no matter how important those economic needs are. And I think we get that from this passage. So if you want some more depth on that, go back and watch last week. The last thing I wanted to mention before we dive back into the content is I referenced this last week, but if you don't remember it, or if you haven't seen last week's video, there'll be some comments towards the end of this one that won't make sense. One of the reasons why I wanted to dive so deeply on this particular passage is because this passage speaks to me, because it reminds me of my family's experience. It reminds me specifically of my grandfather and the sequence of events going from broken and irredeemable in the eyes of a lot of people to being in his right mind, to use the verbiage from this particular passage, and how that was scary for people. And then what he did with that. This story really parallels well with my family history, and so it's personally very meaningful for me. So when we get to the end of the video, I'll touch on that a bit more, but I wanted to reference it now so that you're not confused as to why I took a weird left turn talking about my grandparents if you did not see last week's video. All right, that's it. I hope you get something out of today's exploration, and as always, I look forward to seeing you guys real soon. Jesus comes to this Gentile land, which is an important thing to know. And when they see him heal a man, they don't immediately turn their hearts to him. They respond a bit differently. And how they responded to Jesus in this moment, I think, is important for us to take into consideration. We're going to pick up reading in verse 15. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. I told you at the beginning of this video that in this exploration, I found some things that I had not seen previously. And right here, in this moment, is one of those times where I feel like I saw something that I hadn't seen previously. Part of why these people are scared, I think, had eluded me. But it's powerful to me. They are scared partially, at least, and maybe I'm speculating here, but I think they're scared because they're blaming something on Jesus that Jesus didn't do. This whole scene is wild. Demon-possessed man, pigs, now demon-possessed guy who's sitting there. By the way, the story starts with the guy naked. Didn't even mention that. This whole scene is crazy. It's scary. And I wonder if part of their fear is rooted in the fact that they hold Jesus responsible for killing the pigs. And they're worried about what might happen next. If they hold Jesus responsible for killing the pigs, I can understand a fear, the economic fear of what's going to happen next, because they're blaming Jesus for the death of the pigs. They're blaming Jesus for the economic impact, for the societal impact of what's just happened. But something dawned on me in reading this passage recently. Jesus didn't kill the pigs. What happened to the pigs was a result of the demons, not a result of Jesus. To these people who weren't privy to the back and forth between Jesus and the demons, Jesus cast out demons, cast them into pigs, and then killed them. In truth, Jesus came to heal a man, and he did so by freeing him of demons, and then the demons asked to be allowed to enter pigs, and Jesus allowed it, and then the demons killed the pigs. There is a bigger truth here that I want to make sure that I've said out loud and I've clarified, because I've kind of been hitting on it for about 2 minutes now. Sometimes we blame God for things that we have no business blaming him for. Folks, I know that this truth makes you uncomfortable because it makes me uncomfortable too. But there are evil forces at work in this world. And sometimes we need to remember that. But it's hard to not inadvertently blame God for things, because once you get to know him, you recognize his power and you see how powerful he is. And so we kind of have a natural inclination to blame God when things don't go well. It's real. His power is tangible and it can change lives, which we also see in this story. These people were afraid. Maybe it was because they blamed Jesus for the pigs, or another possibility. Maybe it was because they saw this man who had been previously uncontrollable, now completely calm and in his right mind. That kind of power would have been very scary, especially to outside observers. And that brings me to my second point for today. The power of Jesus can be very scary to those who see it, but don't experience it. Have you ever gone to a retreat or to a conference or some other place where you felt spiritually fed and spiritually uplifted, and you've come back on fire? Maybe it was a youth camp when you were a kid. You come back on fire, you come back re-energized and spiritually focused and spiritually motivated. You ever felt that burning inside you that made you feel like you were new, like you were different? To everyone around you who didn't experience what you experienced, it was probably kind of off-putting, and they weren't real sure what to do with it. Change is hard for people. We've hit on that topic a couple of times in this exploration, that change is hard, even when it's good change. We have a hard time letting people change. We have a hard time not assuming that what we see and what we know is what we will always see and it will always be true. We have a very difficult time with that reality as people. It shows up a lot in the ministry of Jesus, and it's shown up a lot in this video because it keeps showing up in the ministry of Jesus. Change is hard, even when it's good change. When that change is internal and when it's spiritually, it can be virtually impossible for the people around you to understand it. And we have a tendency to fear what we don't understand. If you are someone who has experienced that type of internal change and then been a little disappointed at the fact that the people around you didn't understand it, and didn't appreciate it, and didn't acknowledge it, and you feel like they didn't give you a credit for that change that you experienced, don't be discouraged by that. Change is hard. Internal change is really hard for people on the outside to see. Which brings us to the end of this story, and to, in my mind, one of the strangest interactions in the Bible at first glance. Let's read verse 18, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him, and he did not permit him. Okay, that's the strange part to me, as I read it. Jesus changed this guy's life, and now he just wants to go with him. And Jesus says no. It seems very not Jesus-y, is what it seems. Jesus asked people to leave their homes and families to follow him. He asked people to walk away from their professions, some of whom were actually on the job in their professions when he called them, and they dropped everything to follow him. So why not this guy? Why doesn't this guy make the cut? That was my first reaction to the story when I read it as a little kid. I remember hearing it. I remember getting to this passage, and we didn't really pause and talk about it. Like, he wants to go. And I think there's a part of me as a human being who thinks, well, this seems very not Jesus-y. So why does it happen? The good news is we know why it happened, and we find the answer beginning in verse 19. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So that's why. Jesus knew that this man's testimony would be incredibly powerful to the people who knew him when he was demon-possessed, to those people who tried to help him. I've called in sermons and also in chapel classes before, I've called this story the story of all of us. Because in it, we have a man who, before he knows Jesus, is outcast and broken and lost. Before he knows Jesus, he's dirty. He's a danger to himself, and he's a danger to those around him. He's like us before we knew Jesus. Granted, we may not all have as dramatic a story as he has, but even if you grew up in the pews, you had to come to know the power of Jesus on a personal level as an adult. Before Jesus, we're lost. Then we meet him, we experience his power, and we're clean. We are in our right minds. But the story isn't over for us. Jesus told this man to talk openly about what Jesus had done for him. That meant he was going to have to openly discuss the fact that he'd been demon-possessed. We don't like that part. But that brings me to another takeaway today. Telling people what God has done for us means being open about our imperfections. We want to talk about how God can heal sin. And then we want sin to stay in quotations and to not be personal. We don't want to talk about how he healed our sin. We want to talk about how he healed sin. Because that means we don't have to say our own sins out loud. We don't have to be open and honest about the ways in which we've struggled. We are very uncomfortable with that. I told you at the beginning of this exploration of this text, I told you that this story was so personal to me because it tells the story of my family. It tells the story of my grandfather in particular. He was a demon-possessed man as it relates to the way he lived in sin and the way he lived in the world. But he was healed. And he was put upright and in his right mind. And that last part, where this man was told to go back and tell other people what Jesus has done for you, that was something that my grandfather took very personally. It's why he went from being a factory worker to being a preacher, because he took that part very literally, that his job was to go and tell people what he'd done, what Jesus had done for him. And listening to his conversion story from the pulpit, which I did as a kid, was really powerful. I remember being in our home church. My dad was the preacher, and I remember my grandfather coming in and telling that story, telling his personal story, warts and all, talking about the things that he had experienced and how Jesus had changed his life. And I remember a lot of responses from a very small church. I think I might have been one of them, and I was like 8. So I don't know what I was asking for like prayers for, but it was really powerful because his story was really super powerful because he was willing to talk openly about not just the fact that Jesus heals sin and not just the fact that demons cower in the face of Jesus, but he was willing to say out loud that his sin had been conquered and that the demons that he struggled with cowered in the face of Jesus. Look, I'm not saying that all of you listening to me have to go out and broadcast your deepest, darkest secrets to the world. I'm really not. I'm not encouraging you to do that if you don't feel that that's your calling and if you don't feel convicted to do that. But not sharing how Jesus healed you because you don't want anybody to know that there was something that needed to be healed takes away a powerful tool for the Lord. Here's what I want you to hear this morning. There is not a sermon that is going to be preached today on Sunday morning. There's not a sermon that's going to be preached today that is more powerful than hearing a real person who was struggling with the same things that I'm struggling with, who got their healing from Jesus. No sermon will speak to me in a way that hearing that story will. We're going to explore that idea later on, but for now, what I want you to get is that we have to be willing to be honest about the fact that Jesus not only heals sin, but he heals our sin. He not only confronts demons and they shudder with fear, our demons shudder with fear. That's a hard reality to wrap our brains around, but it's one that I think can change lives if we, as people who have been exposed to that healing power, would be willing to say it out loud. The story of Legion is incredibly powerful, and I've talked a lot today about why it's powerful to me personally, but I hope it's powerful for you as well because there's a lot of spiritual truth in it. I think it's a story that we can all relate to on some level. God has the power to heal our demons. We matter to God. And there's one last note from this story that reminds us of that fact. I mentioned when we started this exploration that just before this moment, before this particular face-to-face encounter, Jesus is on the other side of the sea teaching in Capernaum. And then he gets in the boat and we have the calming of the storm, and then he heals Legion. And then this story ends with Jesus getting back in the boat and leaving. The next words that we have from Jesus' ministry tell us that Jesus returned. So he went back to Capernaum. In other words, something that, again, I missed for a long time in reading this story, is that this entire journey involving the calming of a storm and dead pigs and sending a town into hysterics was to heal one man. That is a powerful truth for us. God loves us, and he cares about what happens to us. There is no extent he won't go through to reach us. And so this morning I want to encourage you to take this face-to-face encounter with Jesus to remind you how vital it is to completely rely on him, to remind you of his sovereign power over the spiritual and over the physical world. And in my lifetime, I don't know that there's ever been a time that was more important for us to reflect on God's sovereignty and reflect on God's power over the spiritual and over the physical world, and reflect on the idea that we matter, and that in this moment, Jesus is willing to sail across the sea, heal a man, and then sail back. And essentially, that's appears to me, at least the way I read it, it appears that that was the purpose of this. It's mind-boggling, right? He did this to save one man, and then he went back to Capernaum. Jesus has that power, and if you will bring your demons to him, if you'll bring the moments in your life where you struggle to him, and you'll invite him in through prayer into those moments, I think you'll be amazed at what he can do for you. So that's all for this morning. As always, Eastridge family, I love you dearly. I miss you. And I am so anxious to see you again. And I'm glad we have a date on the books. I don't know if this series will end up being a one-part, or this class will be a one-part or a two-part. I have a weird feeling it's going to be a two-part because I feel like I've been talking for a long time. Regardless, I'm going to see you at the end of this month. I know that Ken's not going to let me hug you, and he's right about that. I say he won't let because he has to control me with those things. He's right about that. I won't be able to hug you, but I look forward to seeing you again very soon and virtually hugging you. I'm going to do a lot of air high fives when I see you because that'll make me feel like we're connecting. Until then, until we are able to physically be in the same presence again, just know that I love you, I'm praying for you, and I greatly anticipate seeing you very soon.